Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Monaco GP. What did you think of this race? I think we had a really good qualifying session with Q3, shooting it out to the very last second, figuring out who's going to end up on pole, with the Red Bulls kind of fighting through their struggles at the beginning, ended up, having Perez crash out, and then Max making that pole position at the very last second to be able to maintain that pole position for him. But the race itself, what did you think? Thought it started off fairly boring. You had a tad bit of, action at the very beginning of the race, trying to struggle to figure out, make sure that those lines were in order. Then it kind of just fell into that, follow the leader around the track. Now, the rain came. Did that actually help the race? I didn't think it really helped. It gave more intensity to the race, but for the race action itself, I thought it was a little bit slower. More of the situation where waiting for the drivers to see if they can actually make the corners and not slide around the corners and go wide, letting people through, more than actually having people actually pass during the race. So I didn't think the race was that good itself, so I probably gave it a 4 out of 5, possibly a 5 out of 5 at average race, with that rain in that situation, trying to figure out the strategy of when to switch to those intermediate tires or the wet tires. But what did you think? I start off in the back of the grid, if I'm just going to go through this. So I will start off with Lance Stroll, who struggled during this race. He kind of got squeezed in with Albon, trying to get around them. It's really a fight with them early on, causing a little bit of damage to that vehicle, I believe, and struggled, and then got on those intermediates, and then it looked like the car was just pushing the car around the corner, having that not so good action, and so couldn't quite make those, and just end up calling it quits, having a DNF for that vehicle. Kevin was actually doing fairly good in this race, in that mid-pack, gained some positions at the start, kind of maintaining that positions, but they held him out way too late in that rain, that wet conditions on those dry tires, where he just could not make it around the track, just letting people by. They got him onto the wet tires and struggled a little bit, I guess, with the heat in those tires, and was just kind of sliding off or making them wide corners at the beginning of that run. I think he was trying to make up some time from being on those slicks in the wet, but ended up just retiring that vehicle, I think mainly just to help save some engine components, wear and tear overall, as they weren't going to be able to maintain or gain anything out of this race at that point in time. Logan Sargent gained a position on the start, but again, was I got hit with Stroll and some other people around him, kind of causing a little bit of headache for that rookie. He ended up into that 18th position overall, having a debris on that tire, having to come in early to switch over, just keeping him in that back of that pack. So not a very good day for Logan. Nico Hülkenberg was another one of those who gained gained 4 positions on the start. One of those is probably a little bit much on Logan, as he got a 5-second penalty for that, and then he also got debris, so he had to come in and switch out tires for that. And then he got another 10-second penalty for not serving the penalty correctly. So it was a pretty bad day for Nico, even though he claimed he was having fun out there in that race in the wet at the end. So he ended up in 17th, gaining a position over where he qualified, but not that greatest race for the Haas's. Sergio started off in 20th place after crashing in qualifying, and worked his way up to 16th. He had quite a few pit stops trying to get on the right tire at the right time, trying to repair that front wing damage of him trying to come through the field and hitting Stroll and hitting other folks, pushing a little harder than he probably should have, trying to gain up as many positions because he knew he was falling behind his teammate. And you see he's ended up lapping two laps down from his teammate, who actually won the race. So not a good position for him at all during this race, but made it up to 16th from that 20th position. Yuki was actually doing really well. in this race, racing in the points wise during the dries. But as soon as he hit those intermediates, something was wrong with his brake balance or something to that effect, as he was complaining about his brakes on the team radio for him, and that just could not quite get a handle on that intermediate tire on that Alpha tiring. So he was like going wide, having to take off the runoff areas, backing up, getting back on the track. So he lost quite a few positions in that intermediate stint, dropping back to 15th. Alex Albon was doing a fairly good job, but again, wasn't quite the race for those Williams. Kind of struggling along on that tire. Not the greatest position, gotten squeezed out, hitting, Perez and Stroll as they're trying to get by. So doing a little bit of damage here that probably didn't help. Juan Zhou made it all the way up to 13th. He did a fairly good job, passing Logan on lap 19th for that 18th position and worked his way up. He did start off on the softs, switch to the hards pretty quickly, and then switch from the hards to the intermediates when it started getting wet, and was able to maintain that 13th position. So good for him. Nick DeVries, I think, did a fairly good job, especially with his teammate dropping back when it got wet, maintaining that 12 positions, a couple positions away from points, but hopefully we'll see him get a little bit more confidence in that AlphaTauri that we all expect him to have, coming from that nice, position that he was in when he was doing the lower end Formula Ones and the Formula E racing that he's done in the past. Valtteri Bottas came from 15th to 11th. He gained a position on the start and was able to maintain that up to 53, where he switched from hards to intermediates and did a fairly good job on those intermediate tires to keep in that 11th position, just outside the points, as we expect him to have that experience in the wet conditions. So then we get to the top 10, where we see both McLarens. We see in 9th and 10th, with Oscar Piastri doing a fairly good job of maintaining that position with his teammate. He actually came in on lap 54 for those intermediate tires and was able to kind of maintain that with his teammate, more experienced teammate in F1, gaining that experience, really showing those McLarens a little bit more what they can do in this situation. Lando kind of came in at lap 51 from switching from mediums to hards, and then pretty quickly had to switch over to those intermediates due to the wet conditions. So he was a little up higher a little bit, but ended up in that 9th position, gaining points that McLaren really needed. Carlos, on the other hand, started off in 4th, ended up in 8th. He really struggled. He had a penalty. He had front wing damage from fighting with Ocon at the very beginning of the race, knocking that front wing plate off. So that tire on that front left, I believe it was, kind of had a little bit more wear and tear because it didn't have the correct aerodynamics that it should have had for that downforce, and was really wanting to push and fight for that 3rd position and that podium position. And it looked like his team was kind of more concerned about trying to keep him ahead of the Mercedes, and so they were worried about Lewis at that point in time. Switched him over in that pit stop strategy. He was complaining on the radio, and then they had to switch fairly quickly after that to the intermediates, which pushed them back farther into that field. So not a great job for the Ferraris. Leclerc, even though he maintained that 6th position, was kind of in that same situation where having to pit twice more than not quite judging when the wet tires or the intermediate tires would come into play. So they need a little bit of work done on that regard. Pierre Gasly did a fairly good job, even though his teammate was ahead of him. He maintained that 7th position, stayed out of pretty much all the trouble that he could. I don't have a whole lot for him besides him pitting on lap 48 from the hards to the mediums, and then you'd have to pit again for those intermediate tires to stay in that wet condition. So we have Charles Leclerc, who got a penalty for holding up Norris during qualifying. So he dropped from the third position on the grid to the sixth position on the grid, and kind of got stuck in that pack there where he was just fighting for that, keeping it normal. He pitted, started off on hards, pitted on lap 45 for mediums, and then switched over to on lap 56 for those intermediate tires. So they didn't have the best foresight on when to get down to those intermediates or softs. If they had switched over to intermediates immediately, they probably could have fought with those Mercedes and potentially got up there a little bit higher in the grid. You have George, who actually did a really good job, qualifying 8th and ended up 5th. At one point, he was actually trying to get his team to let him pass his teammate Lewis so he could go after Ocon, as he was gaining fairly rapidly on his teammate at that point in time. But something happened during that period in those intermediate tires where he got to a point where he started losing time, and he had a 5-second penalty for unsafe rejoining after one of his pit stops. So he was worried about dropping back into Charles Leclerc's hands, which he was maintaining that gap. So he didn't have a really struggle with that part of it. But instead of actually gaining and being able to pass Lewis, he kind of ended up having to drop back behind Lewis a little bit more than he probably wanted to due to some conditions on those tires. But overall, a good job for him. Lewis, after even complaining on the radio about the condition that his vehicle was in, ended up getting the fastest lap, went up from 5th to 4th, did a really good job with that Mercedes to keep it in that running, and wasn't quite in that line to really fight for Ocon, even though Ocon had a slow pit stop at one point. But did a good job, got that fastest lap before the conditions changed to wet, which gave him the fastest lap overall, so didn't have to worry about that after the rain hit. Ocon maintained that position, even though he was fighting with Carlos Sainz quite a bit early on and getting hit and almost had a puncture there from Carlos's front wing end plate, but luckily he didn't do any damage apparently for that Alpine, and was able to maintain that. Ended up coming in pretty late for his pit stop on lap 58 to switch over to those intermediates. He had a pit on lap 33 to get onto the hards. That was a slow pit stop, but was able to maintain that third position overall. Not quite enough to really fight with Fernando, but ahead of Lewis and them in that fourth position. So good job for Ocon. He got the driver of the day. I could see that, especially after getting that qualifying run that he did and maintaining that position with those Alpines have been in the past. So good job for him. Overall, I probably would say Max would probably be my driver of the day, as he was able to work with that Red Bull team as they were struggling in qualifying, and actually get it to the point where he could actually get on pole at the very last second, and then maintain that during the race, keeping that lead at the start of the race, maintaining that gap that he had, because he started off on mediums where Fernando was on hards, and just running those mediums to their death to those mediums, where Fernando was running on those hards, where he could kind of maintain that gap and hopefully get Max to pit before he did, so that they could try to gain a little bit more when he did that. But Max was able to run quite a bit longer on those mediums than was expected to, waiting for the wet conditions of the rain was coming in, and the Red Bulls ended up out-maneuvering the Aston Martins on that, because Fernando had come in switching from those mediums to hards, and then almost immediately having to come back in and switch to intermediates, whereas Max was able to switch directly from those medium tires to intermediate tires and keep those conditions in that first position the whole way through. As you see, we have lap cars all the way up to 9th position, so there's lots of back cars that the top few had to get through, with that Max and Alonso being those top ones. So they was, losing that gap, gaining the gap, trying to figure out what that gap was so that they weren't going to lose positions for that pit stop that they were trying to plan for that last one to get those right tires and the right conditions for them. So good job for the Red Bulls as they were able to maintain that fairly easily, even though it looked like it was a pretty rough race to go in those wet conditions as people were sliding all over the place, and doing a good job there. Which leads us to the driver's standings. So we can see Max kind of running away with it at 144 points over his teammate, Sergio with 105. We see George Russell passing Carlos with 50 points. We see Esteban Ocon jumping up into the top 10 with 21 points after that podium finish that he did. We see Oscar Piastri jumping up to 13th, and we see a little bit of movement down with Nico and Lando dropping a position here and there as people move forward. But overall, pretty stable as we get more into this season, see how things work. It's probably more to the back of the pack that actually gets switched if they get points. And we have the Constructors Champions with Red Bull running away with it with 249 points, with Aston Martin with 120 in second place. But we see Mercedes, since they had two nice finishes, gaining that points, closing that gap to almost nothing with 119. And then you see Alpine jumping the McLarens with 35 points over the McLaren 17 point that they've collected. Even though both McLarens ended up in points, both Alpines were higher in the grid for the finish to gain those extra points to help them out getting that 5th position. So we'll see how that battle proceeds throughout the rest of the season and see if the Ferraris can claw back into that 3rd or not. We will see. Interesting stuff. So that is the race reaction that I had for pretty much the Monaco GP. As I said, I didn't think it was that great of a race. Overall, there was plenty of stress and reaction for the drivers in those wet conditions to see if they could actually make it around the track at all, sliding in the corners, taking the runoffs, having to back out, push back on the track, when they could, do those actions. But for the actual on-track action itself, I didn't think it was that good. Even with the wet conditions, it didn't really help passing in a sense of passing per passing performance. It was more passing because the person couldn't handle the conditions, and so they were running wide in those corners, sliding off, not being able to maintain those vehicles. I know that's part of the racing and it's part of the experience, but it just didn't give me that warm, fuzzy feeling like I would have liked to have seen in other races when I've seen the wet conditions. What did you think? Did you think this was a good race? Do you think we should keep Monaco on the circuit for next year or the year following? It's up to you. Actually, it's up to FIA, but how the fans react, I'm sure, gives a good indicator for how the FIA will handle things and the money situation as well. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and we'll see you in Spain next week. Until then, farewell.